Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Okay, I'm going to try and play these videos. Everyone ready? Drum roll, drum roll. Okay, so we'll start back with hearing from Tom, and then we'll watch the We15 video, and then I'll go back to the slides. Okay?
It's a sort of dualism between the mind and the body. And so when Gilbert Ryle was talking about the ghost in the machine, he meant the mind in the body. But I don't mean it like that. I mean, I'm claiming that assistive technology is a machine. So when I think of getting my wheelchair fitted or my orthotics fitted, there are parameters and rules and recommendations based, I hope, on science, and I follow those. Your measurements are taken, in other words, but I'm not sure your wishes are always followed. Or if they're impossible, if you're asking for the pipe dream, if you like, I'm not sure the constraints on what you want are always explained. And I think there's a danger of seeing assistive technology as a technical question. It is obviously a technical issue, but it's not just a technical question. Of course, in the current era, we can fix almost anything. It may be very expensive. It may go wrong very easily. It may be hard to maintain, but we do have the technology. And I myself have had that. I have a Bluetooth controlled wheelchair with a electric propulsion. It's gone wrong many times. Lots of different things have gone wrong with it, and I've been left high and dry. And it costs, this wheelchair propulsion technology costs 10 times that which on the street outside in terms of e-scooters or e-bikes are accessible to everybody. So disabled people are reliant on technology that goes wrong, and that, in my case at least, costs 10 times what mainstream technology costs. And I may be thinking particularly in terms of my experience in London, a very high-income country experience. But I think it's relevant to any technology and all aids and adaptations. And what I'm saying is, if you don't listen to the person, you run into a problem. And I want to give you an example. We did research in schools, and we looked at many technology solutions for children, young people in schools. And I'm thinking of a person, a young child who had problems with their handwriting. They couldn't write clearly. Solution, we'll give him a laptop. But he didn't want the laptop. And why didn't he want the laptop? Because in that instance, it separated him from his friends. His friends, his social environment was more important than solving the technical problem of his handwriting. And I could show you all of the excitement about exoskeletons and what is possible and how far robotics and those sorts of cutting edge of assistive technology gets very excited. I've written a commentary on it because is it going to be available for everybody? Is it going to be accessible and able to go into all spaces? Is it going to be cheap and repairable enough really to empower somebody? And I'm not sure it will. So the AT machine, if you like, requires us disabled people to say what we need and what works for us. And I think a relationship between the professional engineer or OT or PT and the disabled person is required. And the relationship is everything. Let me tell you about two OTs that I had when I was paralyzed in hospital. And one of them was a young OT, and he was new to the profession. And he said, my job is to empower you. So what you want, I will try and help you achieve. That was great. That was what I wanted as a newly disabled, newly paralyzed person. The other OT had a look at me transferring, this is a day or two before I left the hospital, transferring to the bath using a transfer board. And she said to me, I can't allow you to do that. And it made me so cross, because I thought, you're not going to live with me. How can you stop me doing that? I will do what I want. And therefore, your job is to say to me, let us work together to make you safe and to prevent the accidents that can occur if you do not use this assistive technology correctly. So AT, assistive technology, can be brilliant, can be an empowering, life-changing thing, but it can also be an expensive disaster. Remember how much AT is unused. Loads and loads of AT is not appropriate, does not solve the problem, and is never used, wherever we're talking about. So we have to think about that social and cultural context. Let's think about the child who, while they had a technical solution, did not have a social and cultural solution because that social cultural context was not solved. Simple, we know simple is often best. We've seen Motivation's wonderful wheelchairs adapted to the environments in which they're used. We know about the Jaipur foot, which is more available, more accessible in a low-income setting. And so it's no good having the best technology in the world if you have a potholed street outside and no pavement. We need to have a technology suitable for our setting. And I think we need to recognize that disabled people are the clients, but they are also the people who solve some of the problems. For example, when I was first paralyzed, my friend Jazz explained to me how to use a car. Now, I passed my test, I was years past that, but she explained to me how a wheelchair user transferred to the front seat, the passenger seat, strapped themselves in, bent over, took one wheel off their ultralight wheelchair, put it in the back, took the other wheel off their ultralight wheelchair, put it in the back, took the chassis over their head and put it in the back, then shut the door, undid the seatbelt, moved into the steering, the driver's seat, and took control from there. And when they got to where they wanted to go, they reversed the process. No OT explained me that. No physiotherapist explained me that. Another disabled person explained me that. Just as disabled people were the ones who told us how to use our wheelchairs, because we have ways of doing things. We understand what we have to live with. And often we innovate solutions to the problems we face. So the ghost of the machine, we must put disabled people in as not just the clients, but also the solvers of some of the problems. And above all, access to assistive technology is the key. We can talk about better technology all we like, but if we don't get that to the people who need it at a cost that's affordable, at a prototype that is easily maintained and doesn't go wrong, then we're wasting everybody's time and everybody's money. And that's everyone's problem, both in low middle income settings and also in high income settings. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
So that was the first video. That, incidentally, is my dog, Yogi Bear. So that was the first video. What did you think?
A lot of it I couldn't understand.
Could you not understand? It's too quick.
The
noise.
around his voice.
Okay.
And some part of it I understood, but a lot of it I missed.
Did anybody else not understand? I can paraphrase.
Yeah, that would be.
So I'll try and paraphrase Tom Shakespeare, which is a really hard thing to do. But in effect, he was saying that he feels like the ghost in the machine of how technology works is sort of making sure that the technology is enabling the person to do what they want to do. And he gave two examples of being in hospital as a newly paralyzed person, and the first occupational therapist basically came along to him and said, right, what is it you want to be able to do? And I'm going to get your wheelchair set up and help you know what you want to do. And he thought, well, that's brilliant. And he learnt how to use his wheelchair and he learnt how to do things. And then the second occupational therapist came along and went on the day he was discharged to show him how to transfer, I think, it into his car, and told him, well, you're not allowed to do that. And he got very angry because he thought, well, who the hell are you? I'm an adult man and you're not going to live with me, so you're not going to stop me. So it's a stupid statement to make, because I'm just going to do what I want anyway. Your job is to help me do it safely. So work with me. And the second example he gave was about a friend of his. I think their name was Jazz, and nobody, although a clinician might have helped them transfer into the car, no one had really shown them how do you really get into a car. And they were the ones to show Tom how to take first wheel off, first of all transfer in, then reach over, take one wheel off, disconnect that, throw that in the back, take the other wheel off, throw that in the back, and then lift it over. And so there's partly to do with the attitude of, in this case, the clinicians, but you could convert that to designers. So the attitude of trying to make sure, your job as a clinician, do no harm, but your job as an engineer also do no harm. So you want to make sure people do things safely, but also you don't want to just tell somebody, oh, you can't do that, and walk away. It's not very useful. But the second thing is thinking about that idea of community. Like, people don't just learn from formal ways, like even in college or school or whatever. I remember my second year of engineering, we had 14 exams in one term, and it was a really difficult semester. And so we just divided and conquered it. We only had 27 or 30 students in our industrial engineering degree. And so the ones that were really good at Fourier transform systems, they did that, and then they would give us tutorials. Those of us that were good at electronics, we'd do that, and we'd show them how to do that. So we sort of helped each other all do well. And I'm sure that that's the same in any community, right? In any learning experience, you learn from each other. So those were the two sort of, I think, key takeaways that I would take away from it. I'll try the other video.
You're such an inspiration.
So brave.
You remind me to be happy.
I love that you don't let it get you down.
Good for you.
It breaks my heart.
Look at you out and about.
You push us all to do better.
You are superheroes.
Really?
Yeah, we're superheroes, all right.
We're getting the kids out the door on time.
We push strollers.
Io sono il passeggino.
Be grateful.
But there's nothing special about us.
We have mortgages.
Kill houseplants.
Watch reality TV.
Pretend we're watching reality TV.
Be a lesson with duvets.
Get sunburn on holiday.
We're politicians and lobsters. Pension advisors.
We get married. We met on a blank day.
And we can laugh at ourselves too.
We love our grannies.
And our go-go's.
We pray 5 times a day. And no, I'm not praying for a cure. I'm praying for a new handbag.
We swipe right. We go on first dates.
And get lucky too.
So are the pedestals are nice?
And the pity tolerated.
We're not special. That's not what it's like.
Non è la nostra realtà.
And only when you see us.
Got that one? That's good, right? Let me just, right. So in some ways, you could argue that video is a disability innovation. It's an advert. It's trying to change attitudes, right? But some parts of getting people assistive technology or getting disabled people integrated into society is about changing those attitudes and making sure that people see, just see people for what they are, which is just people. So I'm just waiting for this. It was saved on desktop, but it wasn't opening from there. So just give me a second. One of the things, there was another bit of the Disability Summit, which I won't play because A, the speakers are not great, but also where myself and one of my PhD students talked about what's called disability dongles. So do you know what a disability dongle is? So this is a dongle. So dongles tend to try and normalize things in technical life. So we try to adapt, fit in. It's like a thing that you do. And so there's a term coined of disability dongle, which is basically all of these design houses keep answering questions and producing products that nobody needs, or worse, they can't get anyway. So they win awards. So there's an example recently of Shaw deodorant have made, and they've won loads of awards they've made a deodorant that's like universally designed, right? So that it'll be easy to use with like one hand, and that's great. It's a design. I mean, Unilever are a massive company, and they've produced a design, and they've won lots of awards, but then it's not in production. Nobody can get it. So from the disabled community, it's a bit like, well, why did you bother? I don't know why. I don't know why we spent so much time giving you feedback and helping you design this thing if it's not going to go to market. And the second thing is when people design things that nobody wants, right? So I think I will get to an example, hopefully, to show you something like that. So maybe in the tutorial, actually. So when you are designing with people, there's different levels, right? So has anybody here ever been somebody who's one of the participants in a study to design something? Have you ever, I don't know, done a marketing survey, for example? You don't have to admit it, right? But it's, you have, right? So sometimes you answer these marketing surveys, sometimes you don't even know you're doing it, right? So I know Instagram shows you something and then you suddenly find yourself clicking through a few things, right? At that point, you're an informant. Somebody's asking you a question and you're giving them information. Yeah, agreed? And so I could do a survey after this course and say to you, or yeah, how enjoyable was it? Did you learn anything? You know, would you like to learn more? And you would give me information. At that point, you're informants for me to then think about how I might improve this course. Agreed? Or you could test it. In some ways, you're testers too, right? You're absorbing this course, you can test things. So you might, some people, for example, are early adopters of products and, you know, beta testing of products, or you might see a bit of software that you really want to use, and so you sign up to be somebody that will use it when it's in beta testing, when they're still debugging it, and you know, you sign up to help the people, right? At that point, you're testers. You're still just testing and feeding stuff back. A co-designer is a bit different. A co-designer is when someone's integrated into the team and you're really designing together. So you're having back and forth conversations about, you know, you were set, you know, and it's not just individuals either. It's not like you're here as a blind person or you're here as a deaf person and you're here as someone with early onset dementia, but you're here as a full person. Do you know what I mean? And also you're there representing a group of people. So you're there giving, you're just helping to be part of the team to fully co-design. The issue is, so in order to do any of those, you need, so for co-design, sorry, you need to overcome three main challenges, right? So you need meaningful participation. So there's no point in us sitting down to co-design with people who are either a bit pissed off with us, don't want to be there, are only there for the money because they really just needed the money, so that's why they're there. Like, and they're just going to say anything because they're going to get paid anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Like, I don't know, how many of you have had jobs that you hated that were just meaningless? Anyone had a job that you hated? I've had a job that I hated that was meaningless, right? So I've worked in probably about 20 bars in my life, right? So when I grew up, I worked in nursing homes, I've worked in bars, I ran a bar in Gran Canaria, I nearly opened my own bar before I decided to become an academic, right? And so I've worked in lots of like bars. I can run hospitality for you, so I get very angry when service is bad. But in one of those pubs, all I did was clean the toilets because the people who were the bar people had decided that they were the bar people. Does that make sense? So they just like, that's all you did. And it was meaningless because you could never keep these toilets like clean because they were outdoor toilets, it was always raining, so I was just mopping rain all day. It was a pointless activity, right? It was really pointless. So, and I was just doing it because I got paid, but after 2 weeks I didn't even collect my paycheck. I was in university, I didn't even bother going back for my paycheck because I actually hated them. I didn't want to see them, right? So and you will get participants that will arrive, if you're not careful, who see you as meaningless, see the whole process as meaningless, are sort of angry with society, life has treated them really badly, and you're not going to get the best design out of that situation, right? You want people to meaningfully engage. You also need some sort of decision-making process, right? So if you're going to co-design with people, you are co-designing. So who's going to make the decisions? So I've seen, one of my PhD students is terrible for this, but I've seen people listen as co-designers, but hear only the bits they want to hear. So I talk to you and you say to me, I'm designing this, and you say, oh, I really like it. I like that it's round. I really think it's great. And I'm thinking, yes, round's really good. That's good, right, tick. But you say, oh, but I don't actually like the fact it's shiny and reflects light. That's really difficult for me. And I just somehow ignore what you've just said and process it as sort of, that's not very interesting to me. So you know when you see co-design spaces and you've got lots of post-it notes on the wall, and it's somebody's job just to capture all of the notes, and then people say no idea is a bad idea. One of the reasons for that is so that you don't do that biasing, which we are all able to do, right? So if my only job is listen, write, that's my job. So my role in that team that day is just to write down everything that's said and stick it on a wall. That's my job, and that's me being part of the team, right? And then once that's done, we can collectively look at it. But everybody's ideas are equal. They're on one post-it note per idea. That's why people say put one post-it note per idea, don't put lots of post-it notes, because then you can move them around and you can decide how you're going to move things forward together. And then you'll have to have those discussions where if you disagree with each other, you have to disagree and you have to move on. You also need some sort of prolonged engagement, or so to develop trust, and also, just some sort of entry threshold. So you're not going to change the world in one 4-hour workshop, so you need people to want to come back. You need to think about how you're going to do that. What's their motivation? We all have intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. How are you going to keep people wanting to come back? There's the guy who's head of computer science at UCL at the moment, Steve Hales, is a good friend of mine, and I was starting an initiative once, and he said to me, the way to understand whether something at UCL is successful in terms of an initiative is, do people come to the third meeting? So he said, people always come to the first meeting. They don't want to miss out. They're like, oh no, I want to be there. And the second one, they'll come just to, in case they've missed, the enthusiasm is still there. But the third meeting, people are beginning to get busy with other things. So you need to see if you've got critical mass at that third meeting. And if you haven't, you might as well give up, because it's gonna dwindle away. So the problem is, though, that meaningful engagement takes time. So it's going to take your time, and it's going to take participants, or like the co-designers' time. So here I've taken this from a good friend of mine, Julia Barbareschi's PhD, and here she was one of my students when we did this work together. We were looking at time on the y-axis, and on the x-axis thinking about whether studies within HCI looked at people as informants, testers, or co-design, and then what impact did people have on the design. And generally speaking, you see a sort of a trend upwards. Does that make sense? Like generally, if people are informants, it doesn't take them long, but they don't have much impact on the design. If they're full co-designers, it takes a lot of time, but they have maximum impact on the design. So yeah, I should have put a case study in there, but I'll move on to it later. So the third part then is moving beyond that function idea. So when you're stuck where you were a second ago, co-design, ability-based design, you can imagine holding a workshop, let's say with blind and deaf people. You want to run a workshop together, and you want to co-design a new technology to be able to listen or interact in class, as an example. And so you could do all of that and look at people's abilities. What abilities do people have? How do they work? You could maybe try and incentivize weeks of development over 8 weeks and see how people come back. But one thing that would still be missed at the end is this idea of, oftentimes that would only then still work in one environment. So as an example, we're all in this room. So we'd naturally our mental model would be, it's going to be used in a room like this. Does that make sense? Not it's going to be used in, I don't know, a lecture theatre of 500 people, or it's going to be used in a small tutorial group, or it's going to be used in a chemistry lab. Does that make sense? Like they would be very different environments, but sometimes when we just do this co-design, we can just get very focused. So Cynthia Bennett came up with this idea that we have this model of independence, which is you've got this environment and you've got non-disabled people doing stuff, and then all of a sudden, if you've got a disabled person, we make this assistive technology to make people independent in that environment so they can get around and do whatever they want to do. But actually, that's not life. Life is sort of people who sometimes interact with assistive technologies working in environments, like in the environment. And so she came up with the idea of how do we begin to design for this interdependence? How do we begin to think about how do people develop technologies, use technologies together? So a classic example here even is, I don't know this system, I don't know the speaker system, I know the video I want to play, but I need somebody's help to set up the audio, right? So that would be a classic example of demonstrating that there's just many people working in maybe not an assistive technology, but technology within an environment. And so it seems quite obvious when it's put like this. Like all good theories, they seem really obvious once they're put on paper. But actually, at the time, it was quite a change. And if you look at, we just done a systematic review actually of some of this work, and if you begin to look at some of the technologies that have now been developed, it might be things like blind people and wheelchair users navigating together, or developing things together, or blind and deaf people, or just the conversation we were having at the back of the room where some people with visual impairment have tunnel vision and some people can see the periphery. But together, if those two people were in a virtual environment together, they could see everything. So if you were developing a new virtual environment and you were matching abilities, they would be a perfect match, right? If you wanted the outcome to be that you could see everything, if that makes sense. You just need to coordinate between them. And this idea of interdependence is getting a lot of airtime in that sort of mixed reality, virtual reality world, where it's much easier to mix abilities and much easier to demonstrate the power of mixed abilities. So if you do all that right, we end up with technologies that enable people to do what they want to do. And this is Koala, who I showed you at the beginning in Sierra Leone. And here's a young girl playing the guitar with her artificial limb. So we'll move on to this idea of I'll just stop and say disability. I was going to restart at this point. So I was going to do a quick recap on disability interaction. So one of the issues is, even if you get as far as interdependence and you're beginning to look at this community factor, it still has that problem I mentioned right at the beginning about not really looking at the link between poverty. So there's been a really good systematic review by London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Nora Gross and Maria Kett also read a paper, and they demonstrate very clearly that poverty and disability are linked. They're interdependent, right? So if you are poor, you are more likely to be disabled, and if you are disabled, you are more likely to be poor. So they are both cause and consequence of one another. So you can't, 80% of disabled people live in the global south, which is relatively more poor than the global north, as an example. And within those communities of the global south or the global north, it will be poor people that are mostly disabled. That's interesting, because when we go on later to talk about routes to market or how we actually get products to people, it makes it a more difficult challenge, because you're not got naturally people who are affluent to purchase what you might want to do. So this makes disability not just a problem of society generally, but a development issue. So development being how societies develop, how international societies develop. So disability is a development issue because of its bidirectional link to poverty. Disability may increase the risk of poverty, and poverty may increase the risk of disability. And there's growing evidence and empirical research from across the world that indicates that people with disabilities and their families are more likely to experience economic and social disadvantage than those without disability. So that was my motivation when I came into human-computer interaction. I told you I worked my first job was in a nursing home. My second job was in pubs, restaurants, bars. My third job was running pubs and restaurants and bars. Then I went to university, where I also still worked in nursing homes and care homes and bars. And I taught maths as well during that time. And then I came to UCL to do my PhD, which was in wheelchair biomechanics. I worked between a hospital and a civil engineering department. And my first spin-out was a device that could measure the biomechanics of wheelchair propulsion in outdoor environments. So you could measure how hard somebody was pushing outside. I went from running a lab in civil engineering called the Pedestrian Accessibility Movement Environment Laboratory. And in that lab, I can show you photos if you're interested later, we would set up an entire tube train. Imagine a tube carriage or a train carriage. And then we would run experiments of like hundreds of people getting off the train carriage, and we would test what's the advantage or disadvantage of, for example, step height or door width or different doors. And all of that information would go into design, which did go into design, the next generation of London Underground tube trains. So when I get on the Elizabeth line, it's funny because I sit there going, I know why the doors are this wide. I know why those seats are there, because I ran those experiments. We also ran experiments for high-speed rail too, to make the business case, which I'm going to talk about later in the week, for step-free access. So demonstrating that step-free access wasn't just best for wheelchair users, but it was best for everybody. And actually, the business case for high-speed rail 2 would fall down if you didn't have step-free access, because you wouldn't make the interchange numbers that you needed at key stations. So I did all that. Also in this lab, I used to do loads of things. It was great fun. Worked with people with dementia. So people would come in with dementia and we would test how they could do certain things, or I'd work with Moorfields Eye Hospital to test how new genetic therapy would work, or I would, I don't know, work with people with chronic pain. right? And people would come in and they'd have an idea for an experiment, and then I would make the experiment happen. And I loved it because it was extreme pressure problem solving. Right? So London Transport of London have £250,000, you need to spend it very quickly. I've got to get a train built, I've got to hire the participants, I've got to get the testing protocol off the ground, and I've got 10 days to do it all. And I used to love it, right? And I had a great team, and we used to have like genuinely so much fun. It's absolutely brilliant. And then the professor of that whole thing is a lovely man called Nick Tyler. Nick wanted to build an even bigger laboratory, and he has done it. It's called Pearl at UCL. I think it cost £48 million, massive laboratory. And at the same time, I was having this like conflict of interest in me. I was thinking, all we're doing is like pushing, and we were pushing science. You know, we're pushing the evidence base for lots of science. But whenever I spoke to anybody who was disabled, or I travelled and met people, people's lives weren't changing. Does that make sense? Like the tube does make a difference. I do think for those of you that have gone to Elizabeth Line, it is a much better experience. And I played a tiny, tiny role in making that experience better. But I was sort of thinking, actually, I wanted to do something that was a bit more globally relevant rather than going very, very deep. And so, you know, Nick's built his lab and gone very, very deep. And I've helped to set up the Global Disability Innovation Hub. And then as part of that, I moved my appointment from computer science. So I had a conversation with the Dean of Engineering, and we agreed that it would be better that I sit in human-computer interaction, because in civil engineering, it's quite hard to do all the tech stuff that I really wanted to do. So when I joined UCLIC, I spent a long time learning about the theories of human-computer interaction. I sort of devoured them every evening, wanting to know more and more about them. And they were all brilliant. And I learned about that ability-based design and Cynthia Bennett's work and Walbrook's work. And it was all really exciting. And yet something in me thought, there's still something missing. There's still something missing. I couldn't, and this is my first attempt to articulate that what's missing bit. So because it's the first articulation, it's the first book, it's the first info, it's absolutely definitely wrong because it can get better. But I think it's a good start. So the idea is that we have to start at the bottom here with disability inclusion as a wicked problem. Now, when I first designed this, that was right in the centre. And my boss, Yvonne Rogers, said, you can't put that in the centre. You can't tell people it's too difficult to do as the main area. And so I've made it this thing where it's more like, it's meant to show that it's like part of the system, but not quite part of the system. So we're not trying to solve the wicked problem, but we are cognizant, we know that disability and poverty are linked. So it's going to, like, no matter what we do, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to know whether we've had an outcome, because we often won't have the resources to do A/B testing and full, RCTs. We're going to have to just trial and go and trial and go. So we'll end up with the fact that it's going to be a bit difficult. And then I thought, well, what are we going to need? What are the main values that we're going to need to really crack this global problem? And so if you start at the top, maybe we'll start at the top. Applied and basic research means that this is Schneiderman, Ben Schneiderman's work, and he'd just published a book a couple of years before I did this. And his whole idea was we need to start with challenge-based engineering that addresses applied and basic research combined. So he has this book called ABC Approach. And the idea is that, for example, I can't design in a lab what's needed in rural town and, I don't know, even just outside here in Madras, right? I have to be in Chennai to know what Chennai needs. Right? So I need to be out there doing applied research of understanding how things are used, what do people need, what's the social economic situation. And then I need to narrow my problem statement down and bring it sort of almost back into the lab to design something very new that can then be applied, but then I need to go back out and apply it to understand does it work, and then it needs to come back. And so we go through this cycle. So because of that, you're going to have to co-create. And we've already spoken a little bit about co-creation, but particularly in this problem, you need to co-create with lots of people, right? So it's not enough to say, you heard Tom Shakespeare, or some of you heard Tom Shakespeare, or you at least heard me paraphrase Tom Shakespeare. And he said, one occupational therapist said this and one occupational therapist said that. So clearly there's already an extra person in the ecosystem. It's not just Tom. It's Tom plus these clinicians he has to deal with, plus maybe, I don't know, building managers, who runs a building if a building has to be adapted. There might also be the transport system of a city. There's loads of different stakeholders. Now that you could go out and out and out to the world, but it's at least going to be more than just the user. Does that make sense? It's at least going to be who buys the assistive technology, who purchases it. So as an example, I use a piece of software. I only found out very recently that I'm dyslexic, which is quite interesting. And UCL immediately paid for some software for me, which has sped up my reading speed immensely. So now when I was marking, I was always late with marking, and I used to be like, I don't know how people can mark on time. I just don't know how we turn it around that quickly. It turns out it's because my reading speed is much lower than the average reading speed. But now with this bit of software, I can read the same speed as most people. So, but I don't purchase that. I'm not paying for it. I have no idea how much it costs. My employer's purchasing it. So in terms of who we're co-designing with, we need to co-design with the people who are going to purchase the assistive technology, as well as the people who are going to use the assistive technology, as well as the people who are going to provide it. So in my case, I had to go for an assessment. Somebody had to write an assessment. Like that's all part of one ecosystem. And at various points, things got lost, as it always does happen, right? And I had to chase things and do things, and it was a horrible user experience. But then we think about radically different interactions. And the reason I say we need to look at radically different interactions, now obviously, some problems faced by some disabled people can be solved with very simple technology that doesn't need radical interaction. But I think I was trying to get people to think that we have to begin to think very differently about almost the next generation of technology and how it can unlock the system problems. So if you begin to think about things like artificial intelligence and natural language processing, can we leapfrog things? Like how quickly can we produce, for example, sign language interpretation that's automatic by an avatar that can translate between sign languages, rather than thinking, how do we train an extra 100 speech and language therapy or sign language interpreters in Chennai? So how do we begin to just push ourselves? So the idea is to sort of help you think that way. Value and usefulness. Sujatha and I have these conversations often. So many entrepreneurs come to us with device. I can't tell you how many people email me a week with like, I've invented this thing, I've done this thing, I've done that thing. And generally speaking, there's two problems with what they've done. The first one is normally nobody wants it. So they've designed it, but not from a problem statement that came from disabled people. So they've designed it and it's not useful. That's the first thing. So it's actually not useful at all because nobody wants it. But if it is useful, they've not been able to demonstrate it's useful. Does that make sense? So they've not tracked, they've made different design decisions, they've changed things, but they've not actually collected any evidence along the way systematically of what might be necessary. So they then get to a point where I had a company recently who've been developing prosthetic devices, and they are issuing prosthetic devices. But now they were invited to have a contract with a very large organization. But of course, that large organization needed CE marking and FDA approval. Now, whilst they've been giving out devices for free before to different people, that's fine. There's no way to now scale to something where you actually, with a large organization, because we need to make sure that product is safe. And then the innovators got very angry, actually. They sent an email to me, At Scale, the ICRC, Humanity Inclusion, loads of people. We all got this email that was like, you're killing innovation, demanding these tests. And we were saying, well, the tests are needed. That you wouldn't get into a car that hasn't been tested. I wouldn't get into the plane that flew me here that hadn't been tested. Like, we do need some level of evidence. And so you're not trying to kill innovation, but if you get so far down the journey and you're already running out of money and you're stressed and it's difficult, and then all of a sudden someone asks you for this, you could have been building that evidence right the way along. So we want to make sure people do that from the beginning. And then open and scalable. You need to just think about how the thing is going to scale long term. So I'm sure Sujatha will speak about her grid model with the standing wheelchair in a couple of days. So that's one model of thinking about how is it going to scale from the very beginning. Potentially a different model would be for digital products. How they might scale will be a bit different to how a physical product would scale. But normally, and we wrote a paper, Sujatha and I, for the World Health Organization's Global Report on Assistive Technology. It's a background paper to that, where we did a landscape review of all of the papers that have been done on AT and innovation and case studies. And effectively, one of the big things that came out was, if you had principles of open innovation, then things work. So open innovation doesn't mean open source. It doesn't mean giving things away for free. It simply means you're not locking it down. When I worked in Medtronic, we used to have a lot of things weren't even patented. I forgot that bit of my job. I did actually work for Medtronic before I became a PhD student. I sort of forget those 2 years. But a lot of things we wouldn't even patent because we didn't want Boston Scientific or Johnson & Johnson finding out about it, so it would just be a trade secret. And so that, in a massive organisation like Medtronic, where you're designing things like angioplasty catheters, mass market, that's all fine. But in disability, we need to be more open with one another, because not one entity is going to be able to do everything. You're not going to be able to be the design house and the manufacturer and the distributor and the provider. You just can't be. So you're going to have to build that partnership, and you're going to have to be open with one another to get the innovation to market. And so in the internal little ring is sort of, how do we measure success? So between co-creation and applied and basic, we might, for example, be looking at participation. Are people participating more? Between co-created and radical interactions, maybe overall well-being. Might also look at power with that disability problem. So how much power does the user have afterwards in terms of societal power, but also power in the design process? And innovation, we would just track it from closed to open, just how open is it? And then finally, systems is just checking if people are using a full systems approach. So oftentimes as a design team in my group, we'll look at a problem space, and then we use these as sort of prompts. So we'll say, hang on, have we considered the system? What system would, do these things operate in? Hang on, have we thought about participation? How really will we get the full community to participate? Will it really increase well-being? How are we going to determine that? Is it psychological well-being? Is it physical well-being? What metric are we going to use to measure that? Power, is this something we are fully co-designing, or is it something we haven't got the ability to do? We haven't got the budget to do. So how will we navigate that? And then with innovation, do we have the right partners that if we do crack this problem, it will be able to go open and to scale? So there's a book. One of the main things that within the book is that I tried to get it so that it would be free to people in certain settings, but I personally would have to have paid $40,000 for that to happen, and I didn't have $40,000. So if you are trying to get hold of the book later, let me know. I can probably get the publishers to give me a large discount code. I don't want you to pay the full amount for it, or at least I can purchase some and give them away. So it's not for you to buy the book. I'm just saying the book exists. The idea is that there might be this ability to sort of remix. So I'm increasingly thinking we don't necessarily need one design that fits all, but how do we make designs adaptable to a range of abilities? How do we make these sort of modular approaches scale? How do we make things adapt to context, adapt to things? So a classic example is text to speech. So I could turn this on and it would read everything out to me, and that's fine, and it's probably also fine if I've got headphones in. But sometimes I might be having, for example, walking through an airport. You want to listen out for the announcement that you're going to leave, but you're going through emails and suddenly there's something sensitive. You don't want your medical appointment or something being shouted out to the world. So there should be certain context that it would know where you are, and it would, mute certain things. So I've spoken about this already, but I just wanted to make sure you had a look at Schneiderman's work. One of the key things in the book, I think, is to think about the choice of problem is critical. So it must be actionable, and it must address civic, business, and global priorities, is what he says. So I really think when we're beginning to think about this challenge-based engineering, how we choose something that can actually happen and how it will address those priorities is important. And if we do that, then we hit the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals, which there's loads more money around for as well, which is good news. And sort of trying to make sure that it's not tokenistic. Disability inclusion isn't just an afterthought or tokenistic. It's part of a mainstream agenda. So just last Monday, Tuesday, I can't remember. One day last week, I had a call with the FCDO, which is the UK's Department of Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And interestingly, they'd asked me to talk about disability and artificial intelligence, but there was 3 different teams on that call. One of them is on, I'm going to get it wrong, but one of them is basically writing the white paper on what the UK, what artificial intelligence can do for development. One's looking more at disability, and one was looking more at technology more generally. So it wasn't just the disability team that wanted to know something. It was the hardcore AI team, the hardcore tech team. They wanted to know, how do they make sure that their entire program will be disability inclusive? not that they'll just have one or two things that speak to disability, but how do you make that fully inclusive?
What does tokenistic mean?
It means, well, sort of, not very good at English. It means like almost like a token. So it's like, you know, like if you had, somebody help me. It's just sort of like a tick box. Do you know, like, you know, like when, yeah, it's sort of, yeah, like that, but it's almost like just a sort of almost pointless throwaway thing. So you know, like when politicians are going for election, I often hear in many countries, oh, you know, they'll come and visit us and they'll give out wheelchairs, 1,000 wheelchairs. That is tokenistic. It makes no change to anybody's life. Most of those wheelchairs will probably be sold by the time that politician is back home that evening. But it's a tokenistic thing, right? It's a token that I care. It's like I've come, I've seen you, I've given you something, and I've gone away again. It makes no systematic change. It makes no sustainable change. And it doesn't actually have an impact on the people. It just makes it look like I care. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm sure if you look up the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll get a better definition. But, that's my best chance. So here are some research questions that might arise. These are not problem statements. They're just more research questions that might arise when you begin to look at this more disability interactions framework. So things like, how do we develop design practices which result in products and services that support the inclusion of disabled people in all aspects of life? So beginning to look at every aspect, not just some. How might we create them that have a positive impact on people's psychological well-being as well as physical well-being? And that's not for people who are just depressed or have mental illness. Like most people will be depressed at some point in their life. You know, most people will hit something that hurts a lot. You know, somebody will die, and it can trigger into that medical component where you begin to lose hope, you know, lose the ability to do things. How do we use technology to overcome stigma? So that video, for example, I would argue it's an innovation. It's trying to change the energy and the attitude around disability, trying to change people's thought processes. How do we create technologies in low resource settings? How do we generate data which can inform policy? So one of the biggest barriers is that it's so hard to get politicians to understand why disability inclusion and innovation is important. And I've said this before, some of you have heard me say this before. I was in a country and I was seeing the Minister for Health. And the person before me was an American that was selling proton therapy. Right, so proton therapy is a type of therapy that will treat cancer. And they were going in and so the Minister of Health was listening to why this American company should come to a country and then that country would be seen as a leader with proton treatment for cancer, and it would be a great idea. That's a very simple argument, isn't it? People know people with cancer. We all know what cancer is. We all know that people get radiotherapy, they get chemotherapy, and we all know what that is. And now someone's saying, well, we've got this new technology and it's better and it will make you look like a really developed country and it's a really great idea. And I'm going in and saying, so it's disabled people. These people, population, 15% of the population, they're normally still with me at this point. Great, so that means people who maybe can't see, that's okay, they get that. People who can't hear, yeah, okay. People who maybe can't walk, maybe have difficulty using their arms, mobility impairments. Also people with cognitive impairments. There's also this thing about aging. There's also, by the way, this neurodivergent population. And at this stage, they're like, okay, so what am I meant to do? So, well, people with physical impairments are normally treated by the physiotherapy department and the occupational therapists in your hospitals, generally under rehabilitation programs. You've also got a speech and language program that's sitting under your other part of your hospital thing. Also, they're really important to think about inclusive education because obviously people need and inclusive employment. And at this point, they're like, so what's the one thing I've got to do? What's the one, what can I do? And it's hard, right? Because you're telling them you've got to make a really complex set of policy choices across probably at least 4 departments. And within those 4 departments, probably 20 teams. And you can see that when I walk out, it's much easier to have a conversation over dinner that night when you go home. Oh, this guy came and tried to sell me proton treatment, right? It's a really simple ask. So what ends up happening is the community gets divided. And what you'll have is the people who represent the blind people will go in and lobby for what the blind people need. And then the people who represent the people with speech impairments will go in and lobby for people with speech impairments. And so And generally one or other of them wins at some point and something happens, which is good. And there's sort of a piecemeal process towards getting to an inclusive whole, but it's not coherent. Does that make sense? So the way we've been trying to sell it at the moment to governments is to think, we often now start with the London 2012 Paralympics and say it was the first inclusive games. It was the first time the stadiums were full for the Paralympics, but also it was the most accessible Olympic Games. And the reason that happened was because it was all embedded into procurement systems. So if you wanted to be a sponsor of the Olympics, if you were Coca-Cola or MasterCard, you couldn't sponsor the Olympics without sponsoring the Paralympics. So what did that do? That meant there was equal money for both sets of activities, right? And then if you wanted to be the person who was going to drive athletes around, you wanted that contract, that's okay, but 15% of your workforce had to have a disability. So it was like there was everywhere, it was built into every contract that in the same way gender was built into every contract. In the same time, when the people were developing the games sites, they hired in teams so that they could hire diverse teams. So they had quotas on their walls of religion, sex, gender, everything, right? And they would say, right, I'm going to have 30 people in my team. Well, 50% of them have to be female, 50% of them have to be male, for example, maybe 1 or 2 transgender or something, but mostly male, female. If you wanted, if you look at the local population of East London, what religions are there? Well, there's a mixture of Muslim, Christian, Jewish, right? So they all have to be represented because we want the games to be representative of all of London. So because all of that diversity was baked in from every single level, it fed into every single design decision because there was always everybody in the room. So inclusion became easy. The budget was there and the people were there, and so it worked. And so trying to get that across to politicians, that if you can, and this it's not just politicians, it's any decision maker, right? So you could be working in a company and you're trying to convince your managing director or the CEO or the head of design or something else. But if you can build it around that mission of inclusion, and later on I'll show you some arguments for how you can do the business development, but I think that's on Thursday, so I will go on to that. So I think we wanted to move on to methods. I don't know if anybody wanted a quick break before we did methods, or are you happy to? Yeah, keep going. What do you think? I don't know, what time do we finish? 10 or 1? Okay, I'll do a couple and then I'll just do, I think I've got 5 or 6 slides. Well, depends if they saved or not. Yeah, I might just do the theory and then we can do the practice in the afternoon. There's just a couple of models I'll just share with you. And so generally, this is how design works. It's research is really messy. really, really messy. Loads of ideas, loads of post-it notes, very, very messy. So that's different maybe to, when I worked in the Pamela lab, or when I worked in Medtronic, for example, and we were going to design a new angioplasty catheter, there was never really this messy bit, right? I was just looking at new polymers and just looking very carefully at the science of the different polymers and seeing which polymers I could blend. And then I would run that polymer through different testing processes, and then I would get, 1,000 answers, 1,000 samples burst at a certain rate, and then we'd try it against another one. And it was a very systematic process. But in design, it's not like that, right? It's not that you don't do some of that, but you don't do some of that until you get much further down the line. At the beginning, it's really messy. Almost not sure what the problem is. You've got a problem area, and then you've got to get to a problem statement, and you might end up with a few problem statements, and then you move into, hang on, you've got the problem statement, then you've got to figure out how you're going to begin to solve that problem statement. There's lots of co-design, it brings you in lots of different directions. You eventually begin to get to a concept, and then you get to a prototype. And once you've got to a prototype, you're into that linear bit that I was talking about before. It's then got to go through all the testing that you need. And you might make small design iterations, but it's mostly done. So another way of looking at that is, there's different models of design, right? Loads of models of design. So one is what's called a waterfall model. And that's it's the 70s. It still exists in large, large projects. So if you were building something like a space rocket, for example, I would imagine you're not going to be agile and quick and change things at the last minute. You're going to have requirements analysis up front. What's really required to solve this problem? You're going to do design. You're going to test that design. That's going to feed back into a refinement of the requirements. Then you're going to waterfall down to implementation. Again, you're going to do testing. and then you go back up at each level of testing. Does that make sense? And you go back down the waterfall. You just keep going. The spiral model, which looks a little bit, it starts with requirements, plan. Maybe I can highlight, I can do that thing with a stylus if I can find it. You start here with the requirements, plan, life cycle, and then you're going this way and you look at risk analysis, then you think about prototyping, then you've got some sort of concept and you keep going, you do more risk analysis, more prototyping. You might then come up with your software requirements, require validation, then you've got a development plan, then you come out and this one is more the software design, and then you come all the way out to actually bringing it to market. So at each level of the circle, you're sort of advancing what you're looking at. At the very beginning, you're looking very core at just a concept. And then once you go beyond the concept, you're beginning to look at, okay, so what does the software need to answer that concept? And then you're looking at, okay, the software is going to be in a product. What does the product look like? So you're sort of spiraling out on each iteration. I'm not going to go through all of the design methodologies because we're going to focus in on one, which is the double diamond approach and beginning to look at that idea. But if you want to, I think there's 900 different design methodologies in this book. It's a free book and it's really brilliant. And I often pick it up because I'm weird of an evening and I have, look at it because it can spark some good thinking, certain design methods, are good for different problems. So I'd highly recommend it. It's very accessible. It's not difficult to read. But what we really look at normally is this user-centered design lifecycle model where we think about establishing those requirements early on, going to design alternatives, rapidly going into prototyping, moving up into evaluation. So we start here, we go, up the way around. We start here, so here's some people out here that can't use this thing yet. Here's some people out here that we've spoken to lots of people. We've figured out that they've got a problem, and from this problem, we're going to establish some requirements to answer that problem. Okay, so the problem statement might be that it has to be a device that sits on a wheelchair, that will be lightweight, that's easily attachable, that has long life battery, and it's answering the problem of how do I fit an oxygen, canister or oxygen device onto a wheelchair, for example, that won't fall off in rugged environments that can go for 10 weeks, right? And so you start to establish some requirements, and you begin to then brainstorm and think about what possible design alternatives you can have, what you need to do almost immediately is start prototyping. In my opinion, until you start making it, you have no idea. It always, in your head, sounds like a great idea. And then the minute you start to make it, it's like, oh, hang on, that's not going to work, this doesn't work. And this prototyping can be really easy. It can start with just sketches, move to just cardboard. I've learned an awful lot about designing things out of cardboard, where we were trying to design a robotic arm device for somebody, and we did a lot of it with cardboard early on because we could quickly make new shapes and look at different joint structures. And it was before, obviously you can go into CAD models and make things really precise, but somehow you don't really get an idea of how that's going to fit to a human being. Does that make sense? You can see it, you can see all the dimensions, but if I put something like this on you, no, actually if you just move it down, it's much more comfortable. You can sort of move things and move with people a lot more quickly. And so those evaluations can be just that. It can be 2 or 3 people in a room where you're just asking people to use it, give you feedback. A thing we do in digital a lot is a think aloud method. So we'll have a click through and it won't be built real. It's just like every time they click a button, we will change it physically. We'll make it seem like it's changed. We haven't done any of the hard coding on it. And then we see people say, oh God, I'm really confused. I didn't expect this screen. I expected this, or this doesn't make any sense. And they just think aloud, and we just capture the things they said that were positive, the things they said that were negative, and then we feed it back to them. And so once we've done here, the evaluating, you might feed back into your design alternatives, and you go around again. They might even tell you, we need to change a requirement. People said they wanted this, but actually we gave them it, and they didn't want it. They wanted something slightly different. A good example is a bus. So going back to my transport days, Nick and his gang were trying to develop a bus for a rural community, I think in Cumbria, which is just in sort of north of England. And they were trying to ask the community, so community bus service, when would you like this bus to come? And everybody said, like they had a town hall meeting, we don't need a bus. We don't want a bus. Go away, we don't need a bus. We don't. But they'd got this funding to develop a community bus system, so they had to do it something. But everybody told them they didn't need it. So they just started running a bus between the hours of 10 and 3 every hour, the same route, just once an hour. And then after a few months, everybody started using the bus. And then they had really strong opinions about the bus. It was the wrong time, it was the wrong dimensions, it should stop longer at this place, it should definitely have a later one to come. You know, people started using it just to go into town and have a cup of tea at the tea shop. Other people went in just to buy milk each day, just to get out of the house. But so everyone needed something to have an opinion about. So once you get that, you can change your requirements, and then you go back through the cycle again. And eventually you'll get to a point where you've done some evaluation and you've decided this is your final product. And that normally is what's called a minimum viable product. It's normally not the thing, the all singing or dancing thing. It's the thing that's good enough to bring to people and to sell and to work with. So some practical issues to address when you start this are, who are the users? Like who do you want to design with? So we're going to go through in the afternoon some thoughts around problem statements. So problem statements obviously should come from users, right? So you might, what if you don't know anybody? Like some people, I don't know about you, but we get problems, master's students, for example, are a good example of people who desperately want to do something, but they've never met a disabled person, so they don't know what to do. Right? They normally have some feeling like they are interested in language models, so they think they're going to do something for people with speech impairment, or they've decided they like computer vision, so they're going to do something for people who are blind. And so it starts from the technology that they want to do, and then it's sort of like they're trying to fit something to a problem space. That's not really going to work very well. So what you really want to do is start at the very beginning with a problem statement that comes from the community. Now, you're probably not going to know people, or you might not know people, but people have problems. We know that. So I'm sure you all have problems, right? I'm sure there's somebody, hopefully there's somebody you tell your problems to, right? But everyone does have problems. One very good way to find the initial problem and to find your users is to work with organizations of persons with disability or disabled persons organizations. So in India, for example, there's Mobility India, who do a great job. In the UK, we've got Scope, we've got Disability Rights UK, you've got the Royal National Institute for Blind People, you've got the Royal National Institute for Hearing, or for deaf people. So you can go to these groups. My experience of going to these groups is that they're inundated, so they're relatively resource poor. Any charity or any NGO doesn't have a lot of money. And so you think, being a person who wants to do good, I'm coming to you, NGO, and I am an engineer, and I would like to solve problems that people that you represent have. And here I am. So what can I do to help you, right? Now, just go away, maybe. Leave me alone. I've got lots of things to do. So generally, you need to think about how you're going to do that approach. And so the very first thing to do, which is at the very least respectful, is to have read about the problem space, right? So any NGO worth their salt has put a website up at least, or they have a report out. They are telling you all the time, their Twitter feed or X or whatever it's called now, Instagram, something else. There's lots of information out there. There'll be reports. Many places will produce short reports that say, we're interested, these are the problems. So for example, in HCI, we just did a systematic review in HCI of all the research that's been done for people who are autistic. And we compared all the research across the whole of the human-computer interaction space that's been published of autism, devices for people who are autistic, with what 10 different agencies globally had said. So 10 different agencies, the National Centre for Autism, all the different ones have research priorities. You go to their website, they will tell you, this is what autistic people are telling us, we would like you to research. 3 papers overlap in that domain. We have hundreds of papers that are published to help people with autism, and only 3 of them answer questions that are freely available to the world. They're on the websites, they're not difficult to find. So the biggest problem in that space is that all of the solutions are about fixing the person. Oh, autistic person has a trouble, I don't know, speaking. This device will help this person speak. The person doesn't maybe even want to speak. The person does want to communicate, and people have to be able to understand that communication. But that's a different problem space to fixing or forcing somebody to speak who doesn't want to speak. Like, I don't think anybody should be forced to communicate in a way they don't wish to. So you need to be respectful. You need to then, I always build small. So I find that rather than going to the massive organizations up front, it's almost better to go to a meetup. So when I was doing my wheelchair work, for example, I did work in the spinal injury unit, so that obviously I met a lot of people there. But I also used to go and play basketball, wheelchair basketball, because anybody can play wheelchair basketball. You don't have to be a wheelchair user. So the teams are made up of people. There's a team in the UK, there's a league in the UK that's made up of people who are wheelchair users and not wheelchair users. So you can play wheelchair basketball regardless. And so, of course, then I go along and I'm just playing wheelchair basketball. So I'm beginning to understand the problems with the wheelchair, for me anyway. And I'm chatting to my teammates about the problems with the wheelchair. And then all of a sudden, we're coming up together with problem statements about how could this help everybody, right? So there's something about connecting with people and how do you do that connection? And definitely not feeling like, well, if for example, I came here and said, I can solve any engineering problem of IIT Madras. I come from UCL. I mean, go away. If Sujathna walked into UCL and said, I can solve anything that you want because I'm a professor at IIT Madras, like to think that you have the answers is completely incorrect. You don't have the answers. What you've got is a really good set of skills. And you can apply those skills to really good problems, but you don't have the answers. You don't even know what the problem is. So you're almost useless at the moment. You've got to figure out the problem statement. One other way of doing that is to figure out, before you get to this, which is who are the users, what are their needs, is to think about just design for one. Oftentimes, a lot of the devices that have been developed have just been developed for one person, and then they've scaled up. So especially when you're starting as a relatively small unit, you can just start with something small. So for example, the Google Relate app that was launched recently that translates slurred speech or dysartic speech, that was developed so that two people working in Google could communicate. And then it was like, hang on, who else could this look for? Who else could this benefit? Oh, it could actually benefit anybody with slurred speech. Oh, maybe specifically people with motor neuron disease. And so they could have done stroke, motor neuron disease, everything else, but they went from solve for one person to broadening out, probably looking at all things, and then thinking, hang on, people with ALS have a really chronic need because their speech deteriorates really quickly. And actually, it's a really interesting problem area because it's really complex, because it's changing quickly. So that's a really good technical challenge, but it's also a really concrete user need. So if we solve for that, it will probably also work for other populations. Does that make sense? So you go from that one-to-one and you scale that way. So I think just being humble is, I'll stop here and we can come back to some of these, stop on this slide. I think being humble is probably the best thing that you can be, and just offer to help. I don't know, like every job I've ever had, it doesn't matter if, I don't know, I finish in a bar one night and I could just go home, but the guys in the kitchen are still washing up. They're always really grateful if you go in and say, do you want some help just putting those dishes away? Because I could just give you a hand for 10 minutes and then we could all leave together. So if you start with just a really small offer of help, like, I just wanted to let you know that I'm really good at repairing devices, and I just wondered maybe if there's anybody that, any of your users that might need things repaired, I just want to say that I'd be really happy to help people, repair the devices. Or I'm really good at website development, and I just thought it might be a useful skill. So what you're doing is demonstrating your skill to people, and you're saying you've got capacity to be of help. You're not saying you know what problem you're going to solve. You're just saying, yeah, I'm a fairly relatable person that can do some things to help. And most people will accept help. And once you've got in, you can do these things. You can then begin to sort of explore that opportunity space. So once you're beginning to talk to people, the opportunities will naturally emerge. And so you're sort of always in this design process, and this is what we'll come back to in the afternoon in the tutorial, is thinking about how you do this expansion and contraction at the same time. Because naturally, some people in teams will be really good at going out. Other people will be really good at coming in. But you're sort of constantly going out and in. So if you go back to this thing, establishing requirements means going in, right? Designing alternatives means going out. Like evaluating, you're going in. prototyping, you could be going out. Do you notice you're constantly doing this convergent and divergent thinking? So this is divergent thinking and reduction is this convergent thinking. And we're going to look at this idea of divergent and convergent thinking in the tutorial when we take the double diamond approach and look at how design works using that double diamond approach and how we test things within that space. Is that okay? I think it's just gone 1, so we should break. Any questions, comments, thoughts before we break? Yeah, so it's a really good question. So just for the mic, for the recording, I just repeat it. So the question is that sort of tension between designing for one person and then designing for a whole population or a wider user group. And the example given is blind and visually impaired people who each person sort of needs something slightly different to get somewhere. So to be honest, there's probably 2 different approaches to that, depending on your resource level. One is that you could just pick the most complex or the most difficult case, right? Because sometimes that's just a really interesting place to design in, and often once you've cracked that, it is more applicable to other people. So you could take maybe the person with the lowest sight or the hardest, the people that are experiencing the most difficulty. Does that make sense? And just take that as your problem set to start with, knowing that it doesn't encompass everybody. The other thing you can do is begin to try and get enough. It's hard if you haven't got a critical mass of people, but if you can begin to generalize the problems, does that make sense? So I'm trying to think of an example in your space, but you might have, for example, some people who like to use audio and some people who can read Braille, just as an example. They're both blind, but for whatever reason, some have learnt Braille, some haven't learnt Braille, but they're both university students, right? And they both want to interact with some course technology. Well, the most obvious thing would be that if you're developing a technology, it would have multimodal. You would say that your design requirements would be that you're designing for people who would use Braille and audio, Braille and audio. So when you start that requirement stuff, you might have multimodal. So it's going to be tactile interface with audio. And then you might say it's got to do, I don't know, 6 subjects. I'm just making this up, right? Because these were the 6 most popular subjects of blind and partially sighted people in the university. You might have some affordability test, you might have something else. And then as you begin to develop with people, you'll realize that you're going to have to make some design decisions. So it might be, for example, that you can't do. So the example I'll give after lunch, the Tecilia device that we developed, initially we wanted to make that multimodal. And then we've ended up with making a tactile only device because it was too difficult to do both together and develop it together at the same time. So we just went with people who would only read just tactile to start with. And now that we've sort of almost got right the way through the design cycle and we're nearly ready to begin to bring that product to market, we're now thinking, should we go back and add audio? But it's sort of like that minimum viable product route where you've just got to try and think about how do you design that out. But generally, if you've only got 2 or 3 people, it's probably not enough to get those general requirements. So I'd almost design for 1 and get that really good and then see, once you've got it working well, who else it might. Otherwise, you end up with this concept of elastic user. Have you heard of this concept? Got a slide somewhere, but if you could imagine a car, so you imagine you want to design a car, and I speak to 3 people, and I'm going to try and not be biased here, but let's say I talk to you, and you tell me, basically you describe a Ferrari. That's what the car you want. And I'm like, oh, that's really good, and I've got all the description of what a Ferrari is, and I'm developing, I don't know, the inside dashboard of the car, and then I talk to you, and you say, actually, I want something that's more like a Jeep. That's what I want. And you describe a family car, right? And if I've only spoken to 3 people and I try to match all of your user types, what I'll end up with is sort of a mismatch. A front end that looks like a Ferrari, a middle that looks like a Jeep, and a back that looks like a family car, which of course nobody wants to buy, right? Because it's just like a mismatch of things. So at some point, that's the concept of this elastic user. You can't just you have to decide, like you're designing a car, there's lots of cars out there, right? So within cars, what are you designing? You're designing a technology of blind and partially sighted people. Okay, that's lots of people, some of whom are blind and deaf, some are blind and hearing, some are blind and Braille users, some, and so you have to decide what your target is. Does that make sense? And so, yeah, And it's a bit of, and that's the problem. That's why it's quite difficult to do, because you expand out and then you come back in, and then you expand out and you come back in a bit. So does that answer? So the question is, if you've got a problem statement, and then under a problem statement you might have sub-problems. So for example, you want to design, I don't know, a wheelchair that easily fits in a car, then you might have a sub-problem statement where how do I make it lightweight, for example, or how do I make it customizable, how do I make it this, and how do you prioritize those features? So I do have an answer. I'm not bluffing, I promise, but I just wonder, does anybody else have an answer? How would you help this problem statement? You've got different sub-requirements. How would you prioritize them? How would you figure out how to prioritize them? So you could definitely do it based on the proportion of people that might need something. So I don't know, you could look up tables, for example, on lightweightness, see how much can be used. The other thing I was going to try, and I'm just trying to see if I've got a blank slide here. So the other thing you could maybe try and do is think about how you would prioritize something. So one way we often use is a 2x2. A decision tree. Yeah, no, you could, yeah, maybe. So you could maybe use a decision tree. The only problem with a decision tree is you're assuming that the requirement number 3 is dependent on requirement number 2, or is dependent on requirement number 1, which it might cascade that way, but it might not. Another way you could look at it is what's called a 2x2 matrix. And so, for example, you've got a user love. I'm going to put love, right? That's a heart. So let's say you've got 15 requirements, right? One of them is lightweight, which is going to be lightweight. One of them is adaptable. So users could say, well, actually, you could ask 100 users, and then you'd say, okay, users really want adaptability. They're not actually that worried about lightweightness for whatever reason. I'm just making this up. And then this axis could either be something like difficulty, or it could be cost, or it could be anything. Does that make sense? So you need to decide what you as a company, cost, right? So as an example here, you might say, okay, people want it to be lightweight. They're not that interested in it being lightweight, and this is but it's a lower cost, whereas this one is a higher cost, and then you've got these trade-offs. So you end up with like normally a table, and normally things that, so if this was cost, and this is highest, and then this is user satisfaction, then you would do everything in this quarter first, because it's giving you the maximum user love with the minimum cost, right? And then if you've got enough money, you'd go to this one, because you'd want to maximize what the users wanted on cost. If you didn't have enough money, you might go here and do 1 or 2 simple things that don't cost a lot, but improve usability a little bit. Does that make sense? But this would be where you'd focus most of your attention. So what's important though is to know what to put on the axes. So in your case, that should come out of the initial user conversation. So if when you talk to every user, they go, oh, everything's too expensive. It doesn't matter what comes out, it's too expensive. Or if they say, well, I can afford everything, but it never works, then obviously it's like, I want it to work out of the box. Does that make sense? Like I want it to work straight away. So that would be your main axes, whereas the other one might be, so you decide on those 2, and then you trade off the things. I can see people looking at their watches, so we might have to break. But does that answer your question? Yeah, we can have lots of discussions in the afternoon, I promise.